who gives the same academics through, I think, one of the most witty speaker I know, who makes us laugh and also remember. And that's why wherever we go as an IGO workshop, he's a part of us. He's actually a gastroenterologist by profession, and he's another Mac lover. Rather, he's a Mac lover, and after that I'm another Mac lover. So that's why one of the editorials I wrote is on Apple on Ice. And the way he uses Mac, the computers, I think a lot to learn. And the reason why I'm saying is even to learn literature. I think even though Dr. JP said he's an old timer, there are a lot of things available, but and you should know how to use your time and learn more. And with these few words, I request Sudeep to give a talk. And Sudeep, actually we have 175 people come yesterday, but after post lunch, it's
no, that's a usual.
Still, we have a good crowd. Yeah. No, I know you always used to say we all take so much effort, and I hope you saw this.
No, that was wonderful. That's okay. A very good.
Because always it pains what Santan. We take so much pains, and then very few people come. But I'm happy.
No, it's a great
audience, and we thank JJ Hospital for that. Yes, Sudeep.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'll be repeating a little bit of what Dr. Nayak said yesterday, because the reason I do that is that your protocol will never be good unless your research question is good. And it is always your research question which really leads into your protocol. So we come to the fundamental point of why do you do a study? A lot of you have to do a study. So I think some of you must be MD, MS students, DNB students. You have no choice, no thesis, no degree, and that's the end of your life. So you're forced into it. Maybe some of you are forced into attending this workshop as well. So, in a similar manner...
All of them. all of them
might be the way you have to do your thesis. The second is to improve your CV. A lot of government jobs would expect that unless you have 2 publications, you can't get promoted from one grade to the other, and you have no choice but to do it. Some people do it for academic arrogance. It's always lovely to say, I publish in the New England Journal of Medicine, or I publish in the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. It's such a distinguished thing. And, you've been here for 10 years and you've done nothing. I can read and write and you can't. However, some of you might actually be interested in a subject. And if you're really interested in a subject, there might be a question where you feel that you need to answer it, except that you don't know what is the best way to go about it. And here, if you can frame the research question and write a protocol and do research, you might have your own contribution to the progress of medical science. And that's another reason why people occasionally do studies, and that's a fairly good reason. And hopefully, if any of you have this curiosity, this talk might be helpful to you. So the second question that you must ask is, why do you need to do a study properly? It's fine that you're doing a study, but why do you need to really do it properly? If you do it properly, it is much more publishable. It's easier to write, it goes to a better journal. So if you're doing it for your degree, no one's going to reject it. If you're going to do it for academic arrogance, instead of going to the Mahim Journal of Ophthalmology, it will go to the Indian Journal or the International Journal of Ophthalmology. So, it'll be far better to write and publish if you're doing that. And it is gratifying because you've done your job properly. And most importantly, you'll actually answer the question that you set out to answer, however trivial that might be, which is why it is important that your protocol be perfectly written, because unless you write your protocol properly, you're not going to get a decent answer at the end. So why are some projects bad? The reason they're bad is that enough thought has not been given at the beginning. So when you actually get out to write your protocol, if you've not done that properly, then the data you collect will be incomplete. Incomplete data will give you an incomplete result, and an incomplete result will give you an unsatisfying conclusion. So the key is that think everything through when you're writing your protocol right at the beginning of your study, so you do not have problems later on. So we all know that the hypothesis is the key step in designing a protocol. And I think Dr. Nayak has pinched my slides yesterday. I think he made it Tendulkar and Rara. I keep Tendulkar and Ponting for many, many years. So we all know that, framing a question like Tendulkar is better than Ponting is not adequate. You need to define it. So better is a very loose word. You want to say better batsman. Then you want to say test match batsman. You're narrowing things down, which you must do in your protocol so that you have a very precise inclusion factor. So that's an important point. You need to define very well what you mean by better. So it has to be a quantity which is quantifiable, a measurable quantity. Otherwise, you cannot do a statistical analysis. How do you do mathematics on something you cannot measure? So you need to have something like match winning scores, a strike rate, or a batting average, something that you can quantify. So height, weight, nutritional score, pain score, vision, something that can be measured. And these will be your endpoints. And you have your null hypothesis that there's no difference between, you disprove your null hypothesis and you get a significant result. We all know that. So where do you actually go wrong in all this? Your question might be too vague. So the most important thing is to have a very specific question. And a lot of theses which are written today, a study of 50 cases of tuberculosis or whatever, study of 25 cases of myocardial infarct. Now, those are questions which are so vague that nothing sensible comes at the end. It is a voyage of discovery. Let us see where we reach. We're driving down a road. I might land up in Delhi, I might land up in Timbuktu. Let us go along this road and where we lead. That is not what your protocol should be, and that is not what your research question should be. Right? The questions that you need to answer when you submit your protocol is so what? Do not do something so obscure that nobody cares about it. And the other important question is who cares? Your result needs to matter. If your result doesn't matter, no one is interested in funding your study, no one's interested in publishing your study. That protocol is unlikely to be cleared by funding agencies. Your research committee may raise a question, why on earth are you doing this? Why are you wasting your time, energy? Why are you troubling patients if the end doesn't really matter? Never be too ambitious in your protocol. I put up a couple of examples which you cannot actually complete if you're in JJ Hospital on a limited budget. You really cannot do this. And supposing you want to study something like the effect of aspirin on colon cancer, it'll take you 30 years to get an answer, by which time your patients might have outlived you. So you need to be very sensible about your time, your resources, and what you can achieve. So make sure that your protocol is designed in such a way that your resources, which are the human resources, which are the patients, your financial resources, which is the money, and the temporal resource that you have to complete it, is all matched by what you do. Right? The most important thing is the knowledge. It is not understanding well the illnesses or the techniques that you're actually studying which leads to problems in your protocol writing. And I'll give you a small example. We were doing a study at Hinduja on something called thrombophilia states, blood clotting tendencies, and portal vein thrombosis, a little area of interest of mine. And I collected the samples, and the kit is expensive, and the kit does 50 tests. So the hematologist told me that I will store samples, and once we get a certain number, I will run them with the kit. So that was appealing. But then I asked him a question that if you store my sample, will the validity of the test alter? Will the result of the thrombophilia test change by freezing my sample at minus 20 or by keeping it 4 degrees? So he had no answer. Went through literature, couldn't find anything. So we actually did a pilot study where he kept the sample for 2 weeks, 4 weeks and 6 weeks, showed that at 2 and 4 weeks there's no difference in potency. But if you keep it at 6 weeks, you get at least 25 to 30% fall in the result. Now this is a very small thing. But if you don't think about this when you begin, and a lot of clinicians don't think about the lab, a lot of lab people have absolutely no idea of clinical practice. So unless you think about all these things at the beginning, the end result is going to be meaningless. So your protocol must have something which is built in to say that yes, I know my samples can be stored for X amount of time. On these dates, and these dates, these tests will be carried out. Otherwise, my results are going to be invalid. So just a small example to show you how understanding the techniques that you're going to use as a clinician is extremely important in getting a sensible result. Right? So we all know what a good question is. There's a lacuna in current knowledge. It can be answered for you in a measurable manner and provide an answer which is not further studies are required. Nothing annoys a journal editor more then a paper which says that further studies are required, because the reflex answer to that, and even when we review articles, I think Dr. Natarajan will be agreeing with me, it's a one-line reply by the reviewer, then please do your further studies and submit your article. I don't want to publish it now. So your protocol should be such that there will be a complete answer at the end and not a lacuna. If you're doing an exploratory study, it is a study to see whether you want to put in more funding later on, whether you want to include more patients, not to get a publication in. So you must be very clear, is your protocol an exploratory study where you're going to ask for more funding for a national body like a DBT or, ICMR, or are you doing it so that you can get an answer at the end and something to publish, right? Now, the importance of knowing this is that your protocol depends on all these facts. So your lacuna in current knowledge is the introduction in your protocol. What can be answered by you and how you're going to answer it is your method. The way you're going to measure to answer it is your result and the analysis that you're going to do to get the result, which should be in your protocol. And the answer that you provide will be the ultimate conclusion, which is not that further studies will be required. So if you understand all the components of the good question which you have framed, it automatically helps you write your protocol and also helps you write the paper in the end. You don't have to jot this down, is there in that file. All my slides are in that file which you actually got. So coming down to the nitty-gritty of actually writing the protocol, when you write your introduction, it is extremely important to be brief. Because you must remember who is reading your protocol. Why are you actually writing a protocol? It is for a funding body, or for your ethics committee, right? Or for your head of department. Right? He doesn't have the time or energy to go through hours and hours of nonsense. He wants something in 4 lines where he can understand what is missing in current literature from what is already known that you're doing. And you need to leave out the obvious, leave out the boring historical details. There's no point in saying people have 2 eyes. Occasionally you might operate and then they'll have 1 eye at the end of it. If you operate twice, they might have no eye. All that is not a relevant thing to say in the introduction. But you need to say what you're doing new and why is it worth doing. So the so what, who cares has to be answered in your introduction. The last line of your introduction will have stated your research question which you have properly designed, that we aim to do A, B, C, D, E. So at the end of the introduction, it is very clear to the person reading your protocol what you're doing new and what is the question that you're trying to answer. When you frame your inclusion and exclusion criteria in the method section, you must make sure that you have defined everything. It might seem obvious to you, certain things like diabetes, blindness, post-operative pain, they sound like things we use in day-to-day practice. But since it is a method which is such that anyone who gets the protocol will be able to carry out the study in exactly the same manner. So whether you are doing it, your resident is doing it, your friend is doing it, someone in China is doing it, that person should be doing it in exactly the same way. Everything should be defined. So diabetes has to be defined as per WHO criteria, fasting blood sugar, this, postprandial this. Blindness, as you're using this vision chart, from this distance, the Snellen score or whatever it is this much. Post-operative pain, using a visual analog pain score, if it is above 3 on that score, I will say that the patient is in significant post-operative pain. But there has to be a definition, and that has to be a definition which is reproducible across whoever is going to help you carry out your study. Homogeneous groups. Now, this is a fairly interesting concept. It is the tendency when you're doing a study to try and include everyone, the cat, the dog, the neighbor, and try and do your study. So you quickly get the number of patients in a short period of time. But the problem with this is that there will be confounding factors, extraneous factors which will affect the result of your study. So for example, if you're doing a study on cancer chemotherapy, you include a 100-year-old and you include a newborn and you include a 40-year-old. It is likely that your 100-year-old might die of old age and not of a cancer recurrence. And that will affect your survival. Certain people tolerate drugs better, certain people tolerate drugs worse. Certain groups have a different metabolism than other groups. So you must take this into account. If you want the only difference to be your intervention, you need to have a relatively tight group of patients which are reasonably similar so that you can carry out your study. Now, there is a disadvantage in having too many people who are similar. The reason for that is that your study has to be applicable to a reasonable general population. So if you say that I'm only studying athletic people between the age of 25 and 30, it's not going to help you treat anyone in your outpatient department, because the odds that athletic people between 25 and 30 are coming to your outpatient department is very small. So you need to be homogeneous, but not so tight that your results are not applicable to a reasonable general population. So this is where the balance comes in, that you understand the illness, understand the relevant confounding factors, exclude those patients. So you're studying a smaller number well rather than a large number badly, but not excluding everybody so that you have something so tight that it cannot be generalized. Whenever you write your methods down, write them down as you would in a journal article for publication. So this is one simple sentence to help you write your methods in the protocol. Now, there are many advantages to doing this. If you, and I'm sure all of you have read journal articles, you will find that all techniques are mentioned. If a drug is used, which company, what dose, everything is mentioned clearly. If a machine is used, who's manufacturing the machine, that is also mentioned. The reason for this is that in your mind, you're very clear. You will find out missing equipment and missing technique before you begin. Because as you're writing it, you'll suddenly realize, hang on, this test is not done in my lab. I'll have to ask my microbiology department, do they actually use this technique? Because you might have read something in a foreign journal, you want to do the same study in your hospital. You think everything is available, but when you start writing down the nitty-gritty, you will realize that this might be missing. So it's extremely important to put everything down precisely. The second thing is that it clears your thoughts. So when you write it down, you yourself know exactly how you're going to proceed. So that when you are actually carrying out the study, there is no confusion that do I have to measure this or do I have to measure that. I have to collect 17 cc of blood, not 12 and not 25. Because the last thing you want to do is to send a patient home and then say, please come back next day, I need 3 cc more blood. Patient is never going to come and that's the end of your study. So if you have everything written down perfectly, these problems do not occur. And you're truly prospective in your data collection. Otherwise, halfway through, again, you'll have to call everyone back, make them measure missing data and all the problems which come with that. How many will you include? Take the help of a biostatistician. You might learn a lot of statistics, people teach you statistics, but see, let's face it, I'm a doctor because I couldn't add 2 plus 2. Others have gone to engineering and whatever. So that is a flaw which a lot of doctors have. The moment, mathematics and numbers come up, you blank out. So you'll always have access to a statistician who will be able to help you. You might have a colleague who has a natural instinct for mathematics and statistics. Take his or her help. But remember the GIGO principle, garbage in, garbage out, right? A lot of biostatisticians don't understand the bio. They only understand the statistics. So if you don't explain to them accurately what you want to do, they will never be able to tell you accurately how many patients you need and how to actually analyze your data in the end. It is extremely important that you have the numbers accurate, because at the end of it, you're going to get an insignificant result and then you are going to write that now I need more patients to answer the question and further studies are required, and you know what all happens when you put that statement at the end. And the only way to actually do the statistics properly is to decide before you start the study how you're going to analyze the data. You all know what sort of data you're collecting, what it's likely to be, and if you have the statistical test prospectively done, it makes for honest analysis at the end, and then you avoid the time-old technique. हमारे पास data है, statistician जी हमें बोलो कि कौन सा analysis करके P 0.05 से कम हो जाएगा. So that is one thing which you have to avoid. So you need to prospectively know how you're going to analyze this data. Now, there are a lot of projects that are going to be cross-disciplinary, and we already discussed a little bit about that. So you need to try and learn about what you do not know so that you can answer this. And there are a lot of good lessons from that good old TV program, KBC. I think we've all seen that. Ask the audience. You are confused about your protocol, the missing techniques. There'll be someone else in your department who will be able to help you. Usually your colleague in the department is your staunchest critic. He'll be more than happy to criticize what you do. Phone a friend. Email is so easy today. You just drop an email to someone who's done similar work in the world. And scientists worldwide are a helpful community. A true scientist will always go out to help another one. So if you send it to someone for his remarks, or you have a problem, for example, you don't have a positive control for your PCR reaction, write to someone, he'll send it to you by post. Very helpful people, just have to ask them. The old one had this 50-50 question. The moment you think you require a strong lab support in your clinician or vice versa, make that person a co-investigator and make them sign your protocol. Make sure that they are second author on your publication. The moment they sign your protocol, it becomes their responsibility as well as yours. So then at the end of it, they cannot tell you, I don't understand how this test was done, or, we didn't analyze the batch in time, because they have an equal stake in the project as you do. So take them on board and make them a co-investigator with you. And at the end of it, there's the option which in the old days was there, which was flip, which they've removed now, but it's a fantastic option. That if you can't manage with all this, there's still a lot of confounding factors. Don't do the project. Do something else. Because you're wasting your time, your money, and your effort, and nothing good is going to come out of it. So do not hesitate where 3/4 way through the protocol you realize that things are rocky, things aren't working out. Scrap it. Don't submit it. Do something else. You will save a lot of effort for the future. So you have to think through your flaws, your gold standards, your controls, what are the confounding factors, and most importantly, whatever data I have collected, will it answer the question that I have actually framed, or do I need to do more? If you feel you need to gather more data, include that in your protocol before you actually start the study. You must write a pro forma to submit with your protocol. Whenever you write your pro forma, the key is to keep the rubbish out. Now, all pro formas that I see start with name, age, sex, address, occupation, father's name. The question is, are you going to analyze the occupation? Is the occupation important to you when you actually do your data analysis? If the occupation is not important, why do you want to put it on your pro forma? If the father's name is not important, why is it there? Right? So you need a unique identifier. Usually, if you're working in a public hospital, you'll have a hospital number, which is unique identifier. You need a strong contact. That is actually all you need as far as demographic data goes. Right? And you have your age and sex and you get on with it. You need to make the answer so that they're objective. Yes or no. Now, this is very useful when you're analyzing, because when you make your Excel flow sheet, you put it in as 0, 1. All you do is press summation at the end. All the ones add up, and even if you've done 10,000 patients, you know immediately how many have it and how many don't. If your heading says comorbid illnesses, and you write diabetes, hypertension, then for 10,000 patients, you'll have to sit and count. Excel has no limit to width. So you have one column diabetes, one column hypertension, one column tuberculosis, one column whatever, one column whatever. 10 columns doesn't take you anything to fill that up. And you put 0, 0, 0, 1. And you add up at the end, you know immediately how many of your 10,000 are the diabetes and the blood pressure. So don't have vague and broad questions. Have questions where the answer is a number or a yes, no, which you enter as 0, 1 on the Excel sheet. Always have a text as well as an electronic copy. The reason for this is you don't know how much data has been lost in the floods of 2005. We don't know when the floods of 2013 are due. It can always happen in Bombay. So you must have an electronic copy which is with you on a pen drive in your pocket. And there are thousands of computer viruses. Your text copy will be useful in case all your data is ever wiped out by a virus. So make sure that you have both with you. Both are kept up to date. And you must fill it up as the project progresses. You know, rats might chew your file, so the data in text may not be there to transfer in digital form. And when you put it actually onto your master chart, patterns will come to your mind. You might realize that there are some horrible complications coming up which you didn't realize. You might realize that you're actually going nowhere. You might realize that, hang on, I'm seeing so many of this group. I might need to balance things out. And then you might need to give thought that, do I need to stop this here? Do I need to modify my protocol? Do I need to go back to the ethics committee? All those thoughts will not come unless you have entered your data into a master chart and have done a reasonable analysis at regular intervals. And all studies where some drug is involved will ensure that you need some sort of data monitoring. There'll be a data monitoring committee which is to look after your data, and you need to submit it to them. So this has to be ready at a 6 monthly or yearly or whatever predefined interval. So everything is ready for submission to them. Patient information sheet and informed consent is a key part of your protocol, which clinicians really don't pay much attention to. This is actually important for your safety, for the patient safety, and for your institute safety. You need to keep it simple and brief and honest. Don't lie to your patient. He'll immediately find out and there'll be a lot of trouble later on. You need to have multiple language translations. Your ethics committee will insist that local language translations have to be included with your protocol. So, for example, at Hinduja, they will ask us for one Marathi one Hindi and English with back translations. Because a lot of members of the ethics committee may not understand Marathi or Hindi. So the back translation ensures that the translation keeps to the spirit of the English version and honesty is kept in the text. So with translations and back translations, it should be part of your protocol to be submitted to your ethics committee. Patients do not pay for research. Patients do not pay for research. You cannot ask them to fund tests not required for their care out of their pocket. Therefore, you need to budget for who's going to pay for all this. You need to have an accurate cost breakdown. And in expensive projects where there's someone else funding you, they will always ask you for a phased budget. The reason for that is no one's going to give you 50 lakh at the first step. Do a little bit, make sure the money is not wasted, and the next amount will come. So you need to plan your study that how am I going to spend my first 5 lakh so that I generate enough so that I can get my next 5 lakh. So that phase budget has also to be a part of your protocol if you're going to do a big study and an expensive study. Need to be very realistic about the time frame. None of us are going to live forever, so we need to be reasonably sure that we are going to submit our project before time is up. It is a waste to do a project that is not publishable. You need to write it up quickly. But the key point is that if you've written your protocol well, introduction is done, materials and methods are done as you'd like it for publication, the way you're going to analyze your data, all your tables are done. All you have to do is fill in the numbers. The statistical tests have already been decided. So you just have to apply those. In a day, you're going to get your results. Then all you need to do is write the discussion and your paper is ready for publication in a very short way. So if you have done your protocol well, you are actually ready to finish your project and publish quickly and get on with your next project. So I'll end at this point. If there are any questions, I'm very happy to take it. Otherwise, I will give way to the better speaker.
Microphone.
It kind of overlap my talk.
No. But no, don't answer for them. No, they can ask. Maybe you can ask.
You give the same talk?
Oh, you.
Not my slides, no?
You give the microphone. You only. No, behind you. But you have to ask. Because Santan is answering. Okay, she's there.
Sir, is there any protocol if I want to write a review or a mini review? Is there any criteria that a junior person can write or?
No, that's a very good question. Now, see, the days of the old-fashioned review are gone. Nowadays, we are doing systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So the old days where, okay, I find 5 journals in my library, I'm going to put the data together and write a review, is entirely gone. So if you want to write a review, I suggest you go to www.cochrane.org, which is the website for the Cochrane database, and they will give you the entire guidelines of how you need to write a review. Writing a systematic review is exactly the same as writing a protocol. You need to frame your research question. You need to frame how you're collecting the papers. You need to frame what data you're getting, and you're going to frame how to analyze it. The Cochrane database will be more than happy. If you're going to write a systematic review, you can upload it for them. They're more than happy to actually criticize your methods. They will upload on their website your methodology so that someone else will not try and do the same thing. And once you finish your systematic review, you're welcome to publish it also on their website, and they will host it for you.
So few journals says that junior person's reviews articles are not accepted.
No.
it's
It
like
is not
that.
the question of there's nothing in the world like junior or senior. A medical student, a non-medico, they're welcome to write. It is the question of what is your review adding. If you've done a systematic review, it's not your personal experience. So whether it's written by a houseman or a ward boy, the data is going to be the same. Because it is the world's collective experience. If you're writing a technique or a method or your experience, then it is sensible that you're a senior person who's done a lot of work in the field. As a junior person who's not done work in the field, why should you be writing your personal technique? But you're always welcome to do a systematic review because you are gathering the world's technique and not claiming it to be your own.
Yesterday I pointed out that the things like postgraduates of John Hopkins and also the fellows of Wills Eye Hospital have got diseases in their name. So I think it's not a question of senior and junior. It's a question of facts. Like you cannot say I have experience of the hepatobiliary surgery where you are just doing the postgraduate. How can you write a review article on that? So the question is what you are writing and whether what's your validity. You have to introspect yourself. So others saying that you are junior, you cannot write. You